was supposed to be our last Christmas together, as a full family before the wedding. That was the plan, anyway. I'd started preparing weeks in advance, cleaning every corner of the house, ironing the embroidered tablecloth that had been passed down from my mother, and pulling out the heirloom china that only ever came out for holidays and funerals. I remember standing by the window that morning, watching the frost melt on the hydrangeas, thinking how lovely the day might be. There was still a kind of quiet hope in me then, the kind that doesn't raise its voice, but whispers, maybe. Maybe they'll be different today. Maybe they'll see him. Maybe they'll see me. I spent the morning in the kitchen. The turkey was in the oven by 9. Potatoes peeled, green beans trimmed, stuffing pressed neatly into the ceramic dish he'd gifted me on our 30th anniversary. It felt right, using it again. I told myself, like I often did, that keeping traditions alive meant keeping love alive. But as the hours passed, and the smells began to fill the house, I noticed something strange. No one offered to help, not even a text to ask if I needed anything. Just silence. Until they came all at once, car doors slamming like punctuation marks on the peace I had tried to preserve. They walked in laughing so loud I had to force a smile to match them. Coats were flung over chairs, shoes trailed mud into the hallway. No one noticed the holly garland I'd strung across the mantel, or the tiny hand-painted name cards I'd placed on each plate. Not one person mentioned the ribbon-tied crackers I'd stayed up to make by hand. But what caught my attention first, what twisted in my gut like a sour plum, was the dining room table. It was missing a chair. There were 8 guests. I had set 9 places, but someone had quietly removed one. His. I asked about it gently, trying to sound casual. Did someone move a chair? I thought I had everything set. Oh, someone shrugged, barely looking up from their phone. He probably won't be able to sit through dinner anyway. Let's just keep it simple. It wasn't said with malice. That's what made it worse. It was said with convenience. He was no longer a presence, just a burden they wanted to streamline out of the way, and I stood there with my hand still resting on the back of that missing chair, wondering how many times I had fed them, cleaned them, carried them only to watch them forget the man who made their lives possible. He came into the room a few minutes later, slower than before, with that soft smile he always gave me when something smelled good. "Smells like the old days," he whispered, reaching for my hand. But his eyes scanned the table, and he paused. I watched him take in the empty space, the gap that hadn't been there before. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with a kind of quiet confusion, and then tried to laugh it off, as if he had forgotten where he was going. But I knew that look. That wasn't forgetfulness. That was embarrassment. I pulled over a stool from the kitchen and patted it with a cushion, acting like it was no big deal. But inside, something in me curled up. Something that had been unfolding for years, trying to stay open, trying to stay soft. And now it recoiled. They didn't even notice. Not when he sat. Not when he struggled to hold the fork properly. Not when he said grace and his voice cracked from trying too hard. They just talked over him. They talked about the wedding, the band, the signature cocktails, who was and wasn't invited. They toasted to a future that no longer included the past. And my husband, my partner of 42 years, sat quietly like a ghost in his own home. I remember watching his hands, those weathered, steady hands that had once built shelves for their toys, repaired their first cars, carried me when I fell. Now they trembled when he reached for the bread, and when he dropped the butter knife, the clatter was met with a soft chuckle from across the table. "He always was a little clumsy, wasn't he?" someone said. The laugh was small, but the silence that followed was enormous. And in that silence, I realized something. I was the only one still holding the thread, the only one who still remembered the stories behind the ornaments, The hours spent picking the perfect pine, the way he used to whistle carols off-key while dragging boxes from the attic. They didn't remember any of it. And worse, they didn't care to. That's when the turkey started to taste bland. That's when the cider felt sour on my tongue. That's when the warmth of the oven no longer reached my bones. Because it wasn't about the missing chair. It wasn't about the butter knife. It was about the way they erased him, like he was just another mouth to feed, another old man to tolerate, a leftover from someone else's chapter. And me, I was just the woman still clinging to the edges of that story, trying to keep the pages from blowing away. But something changed in me that night, slowly, like a door clicking shut in the distance. I didn't say anything, not yet, but I felt it, a shift, like standing in the middle of a snowstorm and finally letting go of the idea that spring would come soon. I had written every name on those invitations myself. My hands stiff from age and years of doing everything for everyone, had held the gold pen that signed the calligraphy, just so I had chosen the paper, a creamy weight, with a faint shimmer that reminded me of moonlight on the lake we used to visit, when the children were small. Every RSVP card was tucked in by hand, sealed with care, as though love could still be mailed out and returned if only I folded it right. I remember sitting at the kitchen table under the yellow light, squinting without my reading glasses, double-checking the spelling of every guest's name. Some were strangers to me, new friends, distant cousins of the fiancé, but I included them anyway. I made space for everyone, even when no one made space for us. The irony didn't escape me. I was preparing for a wedding that wasn't mine in a house that was slowly being turned into a venue, not a home. The garlands they'd hung didn't match my ornaments. The music they blasted during decorating day wasn't carols, but something loud and soulless, a kind of background noise that drowned out our laughter. My laughter. Because he didn't laugh much anymore, not when they were around. There was a time this house pulsed with shared memories. He and I bought it when our second was born, when we still had that restless fire, when we painted walls and patched up leaky faucets between night feedings and weekend barbecues. Every corner has a story. The nick in the banister from a tricycle crash, the place in the wall where he accidentally drilled too far, trying to mount a picture frame, the scratch on the floor from when we danced barefoot and silly, long after the kids were asleep. But now they walked through these rooms like they were scouting a location, taking photos, moving furniture, asking if they could repaint the guest room for aesthetic. My aesthetic had become outdated, apparently. Just like me, just like him. One afternoon, a few weeks before Christmas, I overheard them talking in the living room while they thought I was outside with the gardener. They didn't lower their voices. Maybe they didn't think I'd care. Or maybe they didn't think I mattered enough to care. I mean, it's sweet. She's trying so hard, someone said. But this isn't really her event. It's our day. I know another voice replied. She just has this need to be involved. Probably because, well, you know, her generation being a housewife was their whole identity. That must be hard to let go of. There was laughter, not cruel exactly, but thoughtless. The kind of laughter that brushes aside decades of sacrifice, like dust on a shelf. They didn't know. They didn't know what it was like to give your life to a family, to love so fiercely that your own name fades, that your joys come second, third, sometimes not at all. They didn't know the weight of silence after bedtime, or the ache in your back after cooking 3 meals a day, or the fear that one day you'll wake up and no one will remember who you were outside of their needs. And still I let it go. I folded that moment into the linen drawer of my memory along with so many others, but something inside me was beginning to stir. A question soft but persistent. Why am I the one making all the room? The wedding planning sessions became regular. They used my dining table like a conference space, my oven like a catering test kitchen, my time like an open tap. I made lists, took measurements, made calls for them, and they let me. They let me do everything except be seen. I was useful but invisible, valued but not valued. Then came the day of the seating chart. I asked gently if he and I would be seated near the front, somewhere close enough to feel like family. There was a pause, and then too casually, "Oh, we figured you'd be more comfortable toward the back. We wanted to give the younger crowd the center." The younger crowd. I went quiet after that, not because I agreed, but because the realization sank in like snow through a cracked window. We weren't part of the celebration. We were accessories, silent witnesses, warm bodies to fill a seat and nod politely. Still I kept writing those names. Still I folded napkins in the shape of roses and compared table runners like it all still meant something. I told myself it was worth it, that maybe love wasn't about being thanked. Maybe it was just about showing up again and again even when no one noticed. But each envelope I sealed felt heavier, as if I were sending pieces of myself away with each stamp. When the last invitation was sent, I looked at the list and realized something: I hadn't included any of my own friends. Not one. Not the neighbor who brought me soup when he was in the hospital. Not the old book club ladies I still met once a month. Not even my sister. They wouldn't fit the vibe, they'd said. I nodded like I understood. But inside I was shrinking, folding myself smaller and smaller to fit into the version of me they needed. Quiet, helpful, outdated. That night he and I sat on the porch, wrapped in one of the old flannel blankets. He didn't say much, just held my hand. But when he looked at me, I saw it. He knew. He knew I was disappearing, and he missed me. And suddenly so did I. The house smelled of rosemary and cloves. That was always the scent of Christmas in our home, something warm and savory, something rich. It clung to the curtains, the upholstery, even my sweater. I'd spent the better part of the morning rubbing herbs into the turkey and caramelizing the onions just the way he liked them. And yet, by late afternoon, nothing felt quite right. It started small, an offhand comment, a barely concealed grimace. I was in the kitchen stirring the gravy, humming under my breath like I always did when I needed to keep my thoughts from unraveling. From the dining room, I could hear them. "She still uses butter for everything," someone said with a sigh. "No wonder the food's always so heavy." Then another voice, more clipped, chimed in. "She means well, but honestly it's like cooking from a war-era cookbook." I tightened my grip on the wooden spoon, but said nothing. I told myself not to let it sting. After all, it wasn't the first time they'd mocked the meals that once had them licking the pots clean as children. They'd grown, I reminded myself. People change. Palates change. But still, was it really so hard to be kind? When I entered the dining room carrying a tray of roasted vegetables, they barely looked up from their phones. My feet ached. My back pinched in 2 places, but I smiled anyway. I made sure everyone had what they needed before sitting down last, always after. That's when I noticed the cranberry sauce. The one thing he always looked forward to, my homemade recipe, the one with orange zest and just a touch of cinnamon, had been replaced. On the table sat a factory-made jar, unopened beside a plastic spoon. "Where's the sauce I made?" I asked, trying not to sound alarmed. "Oh, someone said," not even glancing my way, "we figured this one would be faster. He probably can't tell the difference anymore." My mouth went dry. It was such a small thing, wasn't it? A jar, a spoon, a comment. But it cracked something. Because I knew better. I knew how he waited every year for that first spoonful. How he'd lean over, close his eyes, and hum as it hit his tongue like a man drinking from memory. I turned to look at him. He hadn't said a word yet. He sat quietly at the end of the table napkin, tucked into his collar, like always fork in hand, waiting. Patient, too patient. And when he reached for the sauce, no one passed it to him. I did, of course. I always did. He smiled at me, that same small, grateful smile that had once held an entire world in it. And I smiled back, though my heart was sinking fast, because I could feel the way they looked at him, if they looked at him at all. Not with care, not with understanding, but with that vague irritation people reserve for a glitch in the system. He wasn't who he used to be. I knew that. The sharpness in his mind had dulled around the edges. Some days he forgot where he'd placed his slippers. Some days he repeated stories 3 times in an hour. But he still lit up when he heard carols, still reached for my hand in crowded rooms, still remembered the smell of my hair when we danced in our living room on our anniversary. That man, he was still here. But to them he was a task, an extra, an afterthought, a mouth. As I served the stuffing, I overheard another comment, this one quieter, meant to be whispered, but I caught it anyway. Honestly, why is he even here? He's just not all there anymore. I didn't react. I didn't flinch. But I felt something inside me retract like an animal backing into its cave. I was starting to see the pattern now. The way they sidestepped him. The way they rolled their eyes when he asked a question twice. The way they moved around him, like furniture present but unimportant. Later, when I brought out the almond cake, the one he always asked for, the one I baked from scratch just for him, I saw them exchanging glances. One of them even whispered, "Too sweet for me." Another muttered something about calories, and yet they took slices anyway, barely touching them, letting crumbs fall without care. But he took his fork with both hands, sliced the edge neatly, and took one bite. Just one. Then he looked at me, eyes glistening. "Still the best cake I've ever had," he said. That's all. Just that. And it was enough to break me open. Because in that moment I realized something simple and devastating. I wasn't cooking for them. Not anymore. Not really. I was cooking to keep him tethered, to remind him of who he was, of what we'd built, of the life behind the fog in his mind. And they couldn't see it. They didn't want to. They only saw the shell of the man, not the soul, still flickering beneath. So when they laughed at him, when they dismissed his plate, when they replaced my cranberry sauce, they weren't just insulting him. They were erasing me. Because I was the one who remembered. I was the one holding the thread between then and now, between what we had and what we still could have. And I was tired of pretending it didn't hurt, to be overlooked, to be dismissed as old-fashioned, outdated, unnecessary. That dinner ended like most did, with clinking plates, empty chairs, and no one offering to help clean up. I stood alone at the sink as the kitchen grew quiet, the hum of the dishwasher the only sound left. And I thought to myself, how many more holidays do I have left with him? Not many, not enough. And if these were the moments they were going to steal from him, from me, then maybe it was time I stopped giving so freely. The knife slipped. Not dangerously, just enough to nick the edge of the roast as I was carving, making one slice thinner than the rest. I paused, wiped my hands on the apron I'd worn every Christmas for the last 20 years, and looked up to see if anyone had noticed. They had. Of course they had. Maybe we should just let a caterer handle things next year, someone mumbled. Not to me, never to me. Always to each other, like I wasn't in the room. The words landed like a cold breeze against my neck. I didn't say a word. I just kept carving, kept serving, kept smiling with lips that trembled at the corners. But it was more than the knife, more than the roast. It was in their eyes, how they no longer looked at me with the warmth of familiarity, but with the clinical glance you'd give a receptionist or a hotel maid. There was detachment, calculation. Everything I gave was expected, not appreciated. Later, while I poured the wine using the good crystal I had saved since our wedding, I overheard one of them joking in the kitchen. She's trying so hard to be part of it all, bless her. Bless her. As if I were some old woman wandering into relevance by mistake. I turned quietly and saw them rearranging the seating plan again, whispering about which photos they'd allow me and him to be in. Maybe 1 or 2, they said. It's going to be all over social. We don't want the vibe thrown off. Thrown off. That was what we were now, a threat to their aesthetic, clutter in the background of their curated joy. I walked back into the living room where he was sitting in his favorite armchair nodding off. A bit of cranberry sauce still lingered at the corner of his mouth. He'd eaten all of it, every last bite. His plate was clean, and his hands rested in his lap like a child who had done his part. And yet when I looked at him, I saw all of it, the quiet strength, the fierce protector, the man who once worked double shifts so I could stay home with the babies, the man who read bedtime stories even when his eyes burned from fatigue, the man who held me through 3 miscarriages and never once let go. They didn't see that. To them, he was slow, out of sync, disposable. So when someone called from the dining room, "Is he going to stay awake through dessert?" I didn't answer. I just placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered that I'd make him some tea. But inside my heart had already clenched, tight, quiet, determined. Because it wasn't just him they were mocking. It was everything we had built, every late-night hospital run, every scraped knee, every Christmas morning with footy pajamas and cocoa on the couch. They were treating the foundation of their entire lives like a footnote. And I knew then they weren't just forgetting. They were choosing to forget, replacing real memories with convenience, rewriting us out of the story. The worst part was they didn't even realize they were being cruel. Their laughter wasn't sharp. It was smooth, polished, the kind of cruelty that slips by unnoticed because it wears a smile. When the cake came out, they posed for photos. I watched them tilt their heads, find their light angle, their shoulders just right. No one asked him to join. No one asked me either. So I took a slice for him and a smaller one for myself, and we sat on the sofa, just us, the sound of their laughter echoing down the hall like a party we were never truly invited to. "Good cake," he said, tapping the plate with his fork. "It's your favorite," I replied. He looked at me and blinked slowly as if trying to remember something. "The one with the almonds." "Yes," I whispered, just like always. And for a flicker of a second I saw him again. Not the man they dismissed, but the one who danced with me barefoot on our wedding night, holding a record player between us, like a third guest, the one who built a treehouse and a life plank by plank. I reached for his hand and he gave it to me, warm, calloused, steady, the same hand that had held me through storms. In that moment I realized something else. He wasn't the extra. They were. Extra noise, extra ego, extra mouths too full to say thank you. We were the core, the beginning, the ones who lit the first candle. So when someone walked by and muttered under their breath, "She really shouldn't keep pushing him to stay up. It's exhausting for all of us," I didn't rise. I didn't defend. I just looked down at the plate in my lap at the last bite of cake and made a quiet decision. It would be the last wedding I planned for anyone but myself. No more carving myself into pieces to fit their design. No more softening the edges of their cruelty with excuses. No more pretending that being tolerated was the same as being loved. Because the knife hadn't slipped by accident. It had warned me. And I was finally ready to listen. They called him useless. Not directly, never to his face, but their words wrapped around the room, like smoke seeping into corners, curling beneath doors, lingering long after they'd been spoken. And I heard every syllable, every cruel little breath that tried to erase the man who once built an entire life with his hands. It was after dinner when the plates were cleared and the noise turned into idle chatter, the kind of talk people make when they're full and bored and think they've earned the right to judge what they don't understand. I was wiping down the counters, half listening until I heard it. He just sits there, doesn't do anything, doesn't even talk much anymore. Someone laughed. Yeah, he's like a houseplant, quiet, low maintenance, just there. There was a pause after that, a silence filled only by the hum of the refrigerator. I waited for anyone to speak up, to say, hey, that's enough. But no one did. They just moved on, as if it were true, as if it were fair. And I stood there, clutching the dish towel like it was the only thing keeping me from falling. They didn't know. They didn't know what it meant to grow old in a body that betrayed you, to wake up each day unsure if your memory would serve you or fail you. They didn't know how much effort it took him to get dressed without asking for help, how long he stood in front of the mirror that morning trying to tie his scarf just right, how he practiced his smile in silence so he wouldn't look confused in the photos. They didn't know what it cost him to come to the table to pretend he wasn't hurt when they spoke over him. He wasn't useless. He was tired. And tiredness, true tiredness, isn't laziness. It's a lifetime catching up to you all at once. I remember the first time I saw him cry. It wasn't when his father died. It wasn't when he lost his job or even when I miscarried. It was years later, when our youngest left for college. He sat on the porch with his head in his hands, and I remember asking him why the tears. I didn't realize, he said softly, that I'd done it all, that everything I worked for is gone now. But it wasn't gone. It was just growing without him. And that's what they couldn't see, how being left behind doesn't feel like a failure until the people you love start treating you like one. That night, after the laughter faded and the guests moved on to their screens and their wine, I found him in the den staring at the tree, just staring. His hands were folded neatly in his lap, and his slippers had come off slightly, one toe poking through the worn cotton. I'm sorry I didn't talk much, he said. I knelt beside him, fixed his slipper. You don't need to apologize, I whispered. I think I slow them down, he said. They don't like waiting for me to finish my thoughts. They don't deserve your thoughts, I wanted to say, but instead I reached for his hand, held it. Let the silence be kind between us. The tree lights blinked gently, throwing soft colors across his face. He looked tired, not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the deep exhaustion of someone who had given everything, and now felt like he was in the way of the world he helped create. And how it helped me, I had let them feel that way about him. All because I didn't want to cause a scene, because I didn't want to make the holidays uncomfortable, because I thought biting my tongue was noble, that enduring was love. But love isn't silence. Love isn't allowing people to treat the one you cherish like an extra, a burden, a ghost. Love is saying no, not him, not here. I didn't say it that night, but I held it, like a stone in my chest, heavy, waiting. The next morning I overheard someone joking about putting him in a place. A care home, they meant. A facility. They said it lightly, like it was a hypothetical, like they hadn't already Googled nearby options. One of them even said, she'll be able to enjoy life again. She deserves a break. A break. From what? From the man who held my hand through surgery. From the man who worked weekends so we could buy school shoes and birthday cakes. From the man who sat with me for hours when my mother died. not saying a word, just breathing with me. No, I wouldn't get a break from him. I chose him, again and again, and even if his memory faded, even if he forgot which drawer held the teaspoons or which step creaked on the staircase, we were still us, still a pair, still a promise. The real weight in my life wasn't him. It was them, their assumptions, their mockery, their lack of reverence for what came before them. I looked around the house that day and saw how they'd taken over. Their decorations, their music, their voices louder than the love that once filled every corner. I knew then Christmas wasn't what it used to be, not because time had passed, but because respect had vanished. And in its place stood a generation that saw everything as replaceable. Everyone, even him. The morning after Christmas always had a stillness to it, one that used to feel sacred. It was the kind of hush that followed joy the quiet after the tearing of wrapping paper, and the crinkle of ribbon when children's laughter had dissolved into dreams, and the house, though messy, felt full. But not that year. That year it was just quiet, a silence not of peace but of absence. I woke early as I always did. Not because anyone expected me to, but because my body no longer knew how to sleep in. The habit of motherhood doesn't fade just because the children have grown. I wrapped myself in my old cardigan threadbare at the cuffs, but warm enough, and tiptoed into the kitchen. He was already awake, sitting at the table with a blanket over his shoulders and a mug of tea he hadn't sipped yet. The tea had gone cold. His eyes were on the window, watching the frost melt from the glass in slow, deliberate patterns. He didn't look up when I entered, but I saw his lips move. "They forgot my chair," he said quietly. I didn't answer right away. I walked to him, took the mug gently from his hands, and poured him a fresh one. Chamomile with a drop of honey, the kind he always liked. When I returned, I sat beside him and reached for his hand. He didn't flinch. He simply squeezed back, weakly. But there was warmth. "They didn't mean to hurt you," I whispered, though even I didn't believe it anymore. He didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on something I couldn't see. And maybe that was mercy. Maybe it was better that he couldn't remember the worst of it. I thought about the empty chair at dinner, the plate they hadn't filled, the laughter that skipped over him like a stone over water, never sinking in, never touching. I thought about the word they used. Extra. He was an extra mouth. Not a father, not a husband, not a man who had shaped their lives with sweat and sacrifice. Just a mouth. Something that consumes. Something inconvenient. I looked at him, really looked at him. The gray had taken over most of his hair, and the lines at his mouth had deepened. But he was still there. His eyes still held stories. His shoulders still curved the way they always did when he was trying to be small in a room too loud. And I thought, what kind of world lets its elders shrink into shadows? Later that day, they came downstairs, one by one, late and lazy, wrapped in silk robes and hangover skin. They poured coffee from the pot I had brewed, not asking if there was enough left for me. They nibbled on leftovers like children grazing without manners, and when I asked if anyone wanted to help clean up the living room, they shrugged. "Just leave it for now," someone said. "It's not like we're having company." Not like we're having company. I was the company once. So was he. We were the hosts, the hearth, the reason the lights even went up and the tree was ever trimmed. They moved past him without greeting. One even asked, did he sleep okay to me, not to him, as if he wasn't capable of speaking for himself, as if he were a pet or a patient. He answered anyway. I slept fine. But his voice was soft, almost uncertain, like he wasn't sure it was his place to say it out loud. I couldn't do it anymore. Not just the cleaning, not just the cooking, the pretending. I couldn't keep swallowing their indifference like communion. Couldn't keep watching the man I loved be reduced to background noise. And then, as if fate were cruelly poetic, they brought up the wedding again. Around lunch, while he was dozing in the sunroom, they started talking about florals, colors, venues. They had taken over the dining table again, spreading out swatches and Pinterest boards, scrolling and debating. I asked cautiously what the budget was looking like, just to understand where we stood, since we were still technically paying for most of it. Well, if we cut a few people from the guest list, someone said we could afford the designer centerpieces. And someone else casually added, honestly, if he's not feeling well by then, maybe he should stay home. It might just complicate the energy. Complicate the energy. I stood very still, holding the edge of the counter like it might keep me from tipping over. He's part of this family, I said quietly. They exchanged glances. Of course we love him, someone replied quickly. But you know how guests can be when there's confusion. It takes the attention away. Attention. As if weddings were performances and fathers were stage props, as if a little confusion, his gentle meandering words, his slower walk were enough reason to hide him. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I just walked upstairs. I found the guest list in my bedside drawer, found the catering contracts, the floral invoices, the venue deposits, all of it arranged in a neat little folder, my handwriting on every page. My effort in every line. And I thought, if they could erase him so easily, how long before they erase me? I stood in the doorway watching him sleep beneath the afternoon sun. His chest rose and fell with the rhythm I'd trusted for decades, and I knew then I had protected everyone but us. It wasn't just that they forgot his chair. They forgot his place. They forgot our place. And I would not let them forget again. It was their wedding, not mine. That thought settled in me like dust quiet and persistent coating everything. Every decision they made, every glance exchanged across the table, every time they left me out of a conversation, it all whispered the same truth. I no longer belonged to the story I had helped write. The engagement hadn't surprised me. I had seen it coming, the secret smiles, the weekend trips, the way she had started using the word we before there was anything official. And I had been happy, truly. I wanted them to be in love. I wanted them to have something solid and lasting. I wanted them to have what he and I had worked so hard to build. But then the planning began, and slowly the joy was carved into pieces I didn't recognize. The we they spoke of no longer included me. It barely included him. At first I offered gently, suggestions, not instructions. The chapel down by the river has lovely light in the afternoon. We could hang the same paper lanterns your father strung for our anniversary party. They nodded politely, smiled even, but they never circled back, never asked a second question. Never looked at me like my memories were worth folding into their future. Soon the decisions came faster. The invitations went out with colors I'd never seen before, colors I was told were on trend, though they looked cold to me, sterile. There was a website, a registry, a monogrammed logo. And suddenly my dining room table became a production studio, my kitchen a staging ground, my calendar theirs. They arrived every weekend, arms full of fabrics and samples, and rearranged my home with the assurance of people who believed they were improving something. They moved the photographs, took down the crocheted stockings I'd hung every December for the last 3 decades, replaced them with a faux fur garland and metallic initials I didn't recognize. It's more Instagrammable, they said. I wanted to scream, not out of anger, but out of grief. Because somewhere along the line I had been pushed off stage. My role had changed from mother to maid, from wife to witness. Even he in his quiet way noticed. One evening, as we sat on the porch, while they argued inside over seating charts, he leaned toward me and said, "Are we invited to this one?" I laughed too quickly because my throat tightened. "Of course," I said. But he didn't smile. He just looked down at his hands and whispered, "I don't think they want us there." I reached for his hand, held it, tried to reassure him with touch, but inside I felt the same thing. Not in words, not in logic, but in the way you feel when a room slowly becomes too cold to stay in. I was beginning to see that this wedding wasn't just a ceremony. It was a turning point, a rewriting, and we had been penciled out of the margins. The dress fittings, the food tastings, the photo shoots, none of it included me. When I offered, they said they already had help. When I asked, they said they wanted to keep things streamlined. And yet every time the bills came due, they landed in my lap, quietly without eye contact, as if it were expected. I wrote the checks, of course I did, because part of me still wanted to belong. Still believed that maybe if I just kept showing up, they'd remember who I was. Not the woman who cooked their meals or folded their laundry, but the one who whispered lullabies through fevers, the one who stayed awake on prom night until the door finally clicked shut, the one who held their secrets, their scraped knees, their first broken hearts. But I wasn't in those memories for them anymore. They had moved on. And him. He was being left behind even faster. At one planning session, someone mentioned creating a moment of remembrance at the ceremony for those who couldn't be with us. He was sitting right there, still breathing, still trying, still mine. And yet they looked at him like he had already become an absence. That was the night I went to the freezer and took out the wedding cake sample I had made weeks earlier, vanilla almond with raspberry, filling the same recipe from my parents' wedding. I had baked it as a gift, a tradition, a way of offering part of our legacy. But no one had asked for it. No one had thanked me. So I slid it back in, right to the back. Frosted silence. And in that small, quiet gesture, something inside me stilled. This wasn't my celebration. This wasn't even my home anymore. I was funding a farewell. And I would not fund my own erasure. Not anymore. The cookies cooled on the rack, while their voices rattled through the walls like wind through broken shutters. They were in the next room arguing again, over the playlist, what songs were too old, which artists no one listened to anymore. I stood alone in the kitchen, rolling out the last of the sugar cookie dough, pressing each shape with the copper cutters I'd used since they were children. Stars, trees, tiny bells. I'd made these every Christmas since they were small enough to need a step stool to reach the counter. Back then, they'd dip their little fingers into the dough steel bits when they thought I wasn't looking, cover the table in sprinkles like snow. But this year, not one of them stepped in to help. The only person who noticed was him. He came in quietly, as he often did, now shuffling in those wool socks with the heels worn thin. His hand grazed the back of my shoulder, just a light touch, and I turned to see him smiling at the cookies. "You still make the stars too big," he said, that warm, teasing lilt still hiding behind the rasp of his voice. "They always bake soft that way," I replied, brushing a little flour from his sleeve. He looked around like he was trying to remember where he meant to go, and then gave up and leaned against the counter, watching me decorate with the quiet reverence of someone who still believed little things could matter. I wanted to cry. Not because I was sad, but because it was the first moment all day that I felt seen. He didn't ask for anything, didn't complain, didn't demand I change. He just remembered me, us, what this used to be. A few minutes later, one of them came in, barely glancing at him. "Those look cute," she said, eyeing the cookies. We'll probably need a bunch more for the dessert table at the wedding, though. I turned to her slowly. These aren't for the wedding, I said. She blinked. Oh, are they for something else? They're for Christmas, I said plainly. For us. A pause. Then a polite nod followed by a text notification pulling her attention away. She turned and left, already absorbed in a screen that meant more to her than the woman who raised her. And I went back to decorating, quietly, carefully. I added just a touch of gold sugar to the stars the way he liked them. Sweet, but not too sweet. A memory on a plate. Later that night, as I passed the living room with a tray full of those cookies, I paused behind the half-closed door. They were talking about me. She's being weird lately. Yeah, I think she's having a hard time letting go. She probably thought she'd be more involved. It's just a wedding, not her legacy. Then laughter. Soft, casual, sharp as broken glass. And I stood there, a tray in my hands, hearing them dissect me like I was an obstacle to be worked around, not a woman who had given them everything. I didn't enter the room. I turned around, walked back to the kitchen, and put the tray down on the counter. I didn't cry. I just stood there and let the silence swallow the ache. That's when he came in again, holding one of the cookies between his fingers like it was porcelain. These, he said, with a mouthful, taste like you. I laughed then, a short breathy sound that felt more like exhaling a wound than finding joy. He didn't know what they'd said, or maybe he did, and chose not to mention it. That's who he was, the man who absorbed cruelty and turned it into stillness, who could sit in a room full of disrespect and still hold his dignity, like a coat wrapped tight against the cold. And suddenly, I didn't want to serve them those cookies anymore. I didn't want to make another platter, or fold another napkin, or string another light, just so they could sneer and snicker behind closed doors. I looked around the kitchen, the drawers he installed, the clock we picked out together, the crack in the tile from where I dropped a dish during a storm when the power went out. This was my home, our home. And they had turned it into a workshop for a wedding we were barely allowed to witness. They weren't just pushing us aside. They were replacing us. Like old furniture, like faded photos. And the bitterest part was they didn't even hate us. They just didn't care. He finished his cookie and reached for another. I like the bells best, he said. I looked at him, at those kind eyes, still searching for the warmth of a world that kept getting colder, and I thought, you will not be treated like clutter. Not while I have breath in my chest and the strength to say no. Not while I can still bake your favorite cookies and remember the way you smiled at our wedding cake. Not while I still remember who I am. That night I set aside a dozen cookies on a small plate just for him. I brought them to his chair, sat beside him, and we shared them in silence, while the rest of the house buzzed with plans and playlists and Pinterest boards. And I decided right then, I would no longer serve what wasn't savored. The velvet green dress hung untouched in the back of my closet for years. I hadn't worn it since our anniversary party, the one he planned in secret with jazz music and candles, and our children still small enough to dance with us without embarrassment. He told me I looked like a forest after rain, deep and quiet and alive. That memory clung to the dress woven into the seams. I kept it for occasions that never came, until this Christmas. I pulled it out the morning of dinner, brushed off the dust, smoothed out the creases with trembling hands. I wanted to feel like something again, like someone who still belonged. Not just the host or the helper, but the woman he once called the prettiest thing in the room. I took my time getting ready. Soft curls at the ends of my hair, a touch of the lipstick he liked, raspberry wine. I even wore the perfume I hadn't touched in years, one spritz on each wrist. Just enough to carry something old into a day that felt so new and cold. He noticed. Of course he did. When I walked into the hallway, he turned slowly from his armchair and smiled. "I remember that dress," he said. I walked over, took his hand, helped him stand. "It still fits," I whispered. "Of course it does," he replied, pulling me into a gentle hug. "You don't shrink like they say we do." We stood like that for a long time, just swaying slightly, no music playing, just the hum of the heater, the click of the clock. The world outside paused, just long enough for me to remember who I was. I stepped into the dining room, hand in hand with him. No one looked up. No one said a word. They were too busy with their wine glasses, too busy adjusting the lighting for another set of photos, too absorbed in themselves to notice that I was trying, that I had dressed up not for their approval, but because I wanted to be seen by the man who still saw me. But even he, I could feel it. He was shrinking inside himself that night, not out of choice, but from the weight of being ignored. At dinner, I reached for the cranberry sauce again, hoping someone would ask about the dress, hoping someone would look at me, really look. But nothing came. Just another fork dropped, just another joke about his slow pace. I adjusted my posture, tilted my chin higher, sat straighter. I smiled when I should have, nodded politely, laughed even when it hurt. And still nothing. I stood up to refill the cider pitcher, and as I turned, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The dress still fit, but the light in my eyes. It dimmed a little more with every bite, every passing moment where I was invisible in my own home. No one complimented the cake. No one said thank you for the meal. No one told me I looked nice. But he did. Later, in the soft wash of evening light, while the rest of them gathered in the living room to debate linen colors and pose for staged candids, he touched my arm gently as I was clearing a plate. "You looked like a memory," he said, barely above a whisper. I turned to him, startled. "A good one," he added, smiling. "One that keeps you warm when the house is quiet." I couldn't speak. My throat ached with too many unshed things. So I just pressed my hand to his chest, where I could still feel the steady rhythm beneath the sweater I bought him last year. I'd worn that dress for him. I knew it now. Not for them. Not for applause or photos or praise. For the man who still remembered how to see me. But still the wound was there, deeper than I expected. Because even though I had never needed their approval, I had still hoped for their love, and that hope, unfulfilled, began to rot into something else, something heavier. After they left that night, with barely a hug or a backward glance, I stood in the hallway again, staring at myself in that same mirror. The dress shimmered faintly in the low light, but the woman inside it, she was different. Not broken, not angry, just done waiting. Done waiting for recognition that would never come. Done waiting for gratitude that had dried up years ago. Done waiting to be seen by people who only looked at themselves. I unzipped the dress, slowly folded it carefully, and placed it back into the box where I'd kept it all these years. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I was no longer surprised. And sometimes when your heart is bruised enough times in the same place, it stops bleeding. It just becomes a scar you carry quietly, like silk wrapped over bone. That night I lay in bed beside him, and when he reached for my hand, I held it tightly, not because I was afraid to lose him, but because I was finally starting to understand what I still had, and what I no longer needed. They raised their glasses. That part I remember clearly, the sound of crystal chiming together, echoing in a room that had once been filled with lullabies and bedtime stories. The toast came after dessert, long after he had grown quiet, and I had grown tired of pretending everything was all right. They stood in a semicircle, arms looped, faces flushed from wine and the glow of their own celebration. To love someone declared. To new beginnings another echoed. I stayed seated, my hands folded in my lap, my back aching from standing all day. No one turned to include me. No one paused to lift their glass toward the woman who had baked the meal, cleaned the house, and stitched the seams of every family holiday since before they were old enough to say thank you. I looked at him. He was still sitting quietly, half smiling, as if waiting for someone to offer a toast that might include him, but it never came. They laughed and clinked and sipped and planned, and he, in his threadbare cardigan and eyes that had seen all of them into the world, was treated like background furniture, something that had sentimental value maybe, but was too old and too worn to be center stage. They called it a toast, but it tasted like disrespect. I could feel it burning in the back of my throat, a kind of sorrow that didn't scream but hummed, low and constant, like a kettle just before it whistles. And then the final comment came. A joke, they called it. Let's all hope we're not still planning weddings at their age, someone chuckled, tilting their head toward us. Another laugh, nervous, deflecting. Oh, stop, they're adorable. Adorable. That word felt like a pat on the head from a stranger who couldn't be bothered to learn your name. He didn't hear it. Or maybe he did, and let it pass the way he did with most things now. But I heard it. And I thought how strange to be dismissed and romanticized in the same breath, to be deemed useless and adorable, like a child dressed in old lace. I stood then, slowly, the scrape of my chair catching their attention for the first time all night. I'm going to put on the kettle, I said, my voice even. Someone blinked. Oh, you don't have to, we're fine. I know, I said, but I want tea. And it's my house. That last part slipped out. But once I said it, I felt its truth settle into my spine like a straightening rod. It's my house, and I had been letting them live in it like guests who overstay not just their welcome, but their gratitude. In the kitchen the water boiled. I let it. I stood in front of the window, fingers tight around the edge of the sink, staring out at the moonlit backyard where he once built a swing for the children, where he had hammered boards in the summer sun while I brought out lemonade and warned him not to forget the sunscreen. That swing had rotted now, just a rusted chain and one board, still clinging to the tree. When he entered the kitchen a few minutes later, he didn't say anything. He just sat at the table, folded his hands, and waited. I'm sorry about tonight, I said quietly. He shook his head. You didn't do anything wrong. That's just it, I whispered. I keep doing everything right, and still, we're not part of it. He looked down at his hands, then at me. They don't know what they've lost. It was the first clear, sharp thing he'd said all day, and it nearly split me in two. I brought him his tea, sat beside him, let the steam fog my glasses and the stillness press into my bones. That's when the tears finally came. Not loud, just a slow river along my cheekbones. He reached over thumb, grazing my face like he had done 1,000 times before, and I leaned into it like the woman I used to be. When I returned to the dining room to gather the glasses, the toasting had ended. The talk had moved on. They didn't ask where we'd gone, didn't notice the absence. And that absence began to feel like a gift, because in being left out, I had begun to find the edges of myself again. The woman who used to paint in the afternoons, who danced in bare feet, who loved in silence and in service, but who still deserved more than polite neglect. I gathered the empty glasses one by one, the ones I had polished for hours the day before. My reflection curved across their surfaces like a ghost. And I thought, maybe it's not that they forgot us. Maybe they never really saw us at all. He dropped the spoon. It slipped from his hand and clattered against the floor, just a piece of silver making a bit of noise. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't messy. just an accident. But the silence that followed, that was the part that hurt. No one moved. No one said, "It's all right," or "Let me get that for you." Not even a chuckle to ease the sting. Instead, someone gave a light sigh, barely audible but full of judgment. "He's always dropping things lately," someone muttered. "It's kind of a pattern." Then a laugh, small, clipped. He bent to pick it up himself, but his knees creaked and his fingers shook. I was already beside him, crouched down with a napkin, gently lifting the spoon, dabbing away what little had spilled. I touched his hand, steadied him, and whispered, "You're fine. Let me." His eyes didn't meet mine. They stared at the floor, glassy with something I couldn't name. Embarrassment. Shame. Grief. The man who once lifted our children onto his shoulders now trembled over a spoon. And still they didn't help, didn't see, didn't care. They turned back to their wine, their chatter, their endless talk of honeymoon plans and signature cocktails. The room spun on without him. And in that moment, I realized they didn't want him to be part of their celebration. They wanted him to sit quietly in the corner and not remind them of time, of aging, of anything less than polished perfection. But he was here, still here, and so was I. He sat back in his chair, rigid and small, and I saw the old habit flicker in his fingers, reaching to smooth down his collar to fix what he thought might be out of place. He was always trying not to be a bother, always apologizing for simply existing. When did that start? And how had I let it go on this long? Later that evening, as the others settled into the living room for board games and playlists and another round of drinks, I found him alone in the hallway, sitting on the bench by the coat rack, one shoe on, one still in his hand. "Need help?" I asked softly. He looked up and smiled sheepish. "Too many laces," he said. "I forget which ones I already tied." I knelt again, my knees aching from the day, and helped him slip it on. "There. Good as new." "Not quite," he said, but he laughed a small breathy sound. "Thank you." And then without looking up, he asked, "Do they know?" "Know what?" "That I'm still me." I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. My chest tightened around the truth. "I know," I said. "That's what matters." He reached for my hand again, and this time he gripped it with more strength than I expected. Not desperate, just certain. That moment right there on the bench, half-dressed, half-forgotten, was more intimate than the entire evening. Because in it I saw all of him. And I saw myself too. Not as the version they wanted. The help, the cook, the woman who stayed out of the way, but as the one who remembered. Who still knew how to kneel beside the man she chose and say, "You are not invisible, not to me." That night, when the guests had gone upstairs or left and the house was dim and quiet again, I returned to that moment. I relived it. The way his hands shook but still sought mine, the way he smiled through the hurt. And I realized this wasn't the first spoon he had dropped. There had been others. The one at Thanksgiving, when he accidentally knocked his glass and apologized for 20 minutes. The one last summer when he dropped his pen during a family game night and no one waited for him to rejoin the score sheet. Each time a little piece of him was chipped away, and each time I'd watched, hurt, angry, quiet. But not anymore. I walked to the kitchen, found the drawer where I kept the spare utensils, and pulled out the box of old silver we used to save for special occasions. I polished one of the spoons, an antique, heavier in the hand, engraved with a tiny rose, at the tip of the handle. The next morning, I set it at his place at the table. Just one small gesture, but it mattered. Because it said, "You are worth more than what they see. You are still here. You still matter." He noticed it, of course. picked it up, carefully rolled it between his fingers. "Fancy," he said. "For you," I replied. And when he smiled, really smiled, I realized it might be the first time in weeks that he felt special. Not pitied, not managed, just loved. With the right spoon, at the right seat, in the home we built. Not everything needed to be loud to matter. Sometimes quiet love is the loudest thing in the room. The dishes clinked one by one into the soapy water, their edges smudged with the fingerprints of people who had eaten, without noticing the hands that fed them. The sink was deep with suds, the kind that used to bubble over when the children were small and liked to help wash sleeves soaked and laughter loud. Now it was just me up to my elbows in warm water, scraping away what was left of a dinner I no longer wanted to remember. No one had offered to help. They never did, really. Not since they were old enough to excuse themselves with phones and work and schedules, and the vague promise of catching up next time. I stacked the plates with more care than they deserved, ceramic chipped at the edges, each one older than the youngest guest, who had left it behind without a second glance. My wrists ached. My lower back sent a dull throb down one leg. Still, I moved slowly, methodically, as if keeping my hands busy could keep the ache in my chest from rising. He was sitting nearby in the den, dozing in the warm glow of the fireplace. I could see him through the kitchen doorway, his head tilted gently to the side, a quilt tucked over his lap like I used to do for our babies in winter. That image alone softened the bitterness that had started to settle in me. And yet, as I wiped down the counter for the third time, the silence kept ringing louder than any carol on the stereo. The house wasn't empty, but it felt hollow. Earlier, someone had joked about how every old woman seems to love cleaning during holidays, as if I hadn't cooked the entire meal, hosted the event, and cleared every dish, while they scrolled on their phones and talked about themselves. "I don't know how she does it," someone said, laughing. "I'm exhausted just watching her." They weren't watching. That was the problem. They were witnessing a performance they assumed was effortless, because it had always been free. But love is never free. It costs pieces of you, time, energy, tenderness, until you look in the mirror and barely recognize the woman who gave it all away so quietly. And for what? A thankless tradition. A seat at a table where I had to ask for permission to speak. A celebration I paid for with everything but joy. I set the final glass to dry and turned off the tap. My hands were pruned, the skin along my knuckles red and cracked. I stood there a long time, palms resting on the edge of the sink, staring out the window into the dark. Snow had begun to fall soft and slow, catching the light from the porch in little drifting sparks. The kind of snow that used to send our children running outside, arms outstretched, tongues catching flakes. He and I used to watch from the same window, fingers laced, hearts full. Now the only light left in the house flickered quietly in the den. I turned off the kitchen light, dried my hands and walked to him, sat beside him, rested my head on his shoulder. He stirred, smiled faintly, and reached for my hand. "Tired?" he asked. I nodded, a little. "They're gone. Upstairs, or gone home. Doesn't make much difference." He didn't say anything to that, just squeezed my fingers in that old steady rhythm that always meant, "I'm here." After a moment, I said, "No one helped with the dishes." He gave a small amused grunt. Never did, really. I laughed, but it caught in my throat. I used to think doing it all for them would make them see, that they'd know how much we love them, that they'd remember. "They'll remember someday," he said. "Will they?" He looked at me, eyes clearer than they had been all evening. "You will. And maybe that's what matters most, that I remember, that I carry every holiday, every scraped plate, every small act of care, like a quilt stitched across time. But I also knew deep in my bones that I couldn't keep carrying it all alone. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I left the last pan in the sink. Just one. Still sticky with glaze and gravy, not harmful, not urgent, just unfinished. I would not martyr myself on a casserole dish tonight. Instead, I helped him to bed, brushed my teeth while he changed, tucked the blanket around his shoulders and kissed his forehead like I always did. Then I stood there at the doorway to our bedroom, looking out at the house I had cleaned from floor to ceiling, the decorations I had put up with trembling arms, the gifts I had wrapped late at night while they slept upstairs, the memories hanging like paper-thin ghosts over everything. And I whispered aloud to no one in particular I deserved to rest too. It wasn't loud, it wasn't brave, but it was the beginning of a boundary. And sometimes a boundary is the most radical kind of love a woman can give herself. The cake was still in the fridge, the wedding cake sample I had made weeks earlier, 3 thin layers of almond and raspberry, with a smear of vanilla buttercream between them wrapped in parchment, sealed tight against the cold. I had meant to bring it out that night after dinner after the toasts. It was supposed to be a surprise, a gesture. One more quiet offering in a long line of quiet offerings. But when I opened the fridge that evening, staring at the soft shape of it tucked in the back corner, I didn't reach for it. I slid it further back instead, behind the leftover cranberry sauce and the jar of pickled onions they all said they hated. I closed the door gently, deliberately, as if by hiding it I could also bury the ache that had begun to swell in my chest. Because they didn't want it. Not really. They didn't ask if I'd prepared anything. They didn't save space for it on the dessert table, now cluttered with store-bought pastries and carefully plated macarons from a bakery downtown. They brought their own sweets, their own sparkle, their own curated version of celebration. Mine wasn't part of the aesthetic. I stood there for a long time with my hand on the refrigerator door, thinking about how many cakes I'd made in this kitchen. Birthday cakes lopsided with candles, cupcakes for school parties, pies with crusts that cracked, and fillings that spilled. He used to sneak pieces from the cooling rack, always pretending he thought they were test batches. They never saw those things. They only saw what was missing from their version of the world. And I, foolish stubborn, I had tried to bring something sacred to a table that had no room for it. So I didn't serve the cake. I left it untouched. But it wasn't just about the cake. It was about everything I'd been pushing down year after year, moment after moment. All the soft refusals I swallowed. All the holidays I carried on my back while they enjoyed judge-discarded. I sat down in the armchair beside the fire, a slice of silence in my hands instead of dessert, and watched them laugh. Planning, scheming, posing, their smiles lit only for the flash of a camera, their eyes never once finding me. He dozed again, his head tilted back, fingers twitching softly in his lap. I reached for the quilt and pulled it over him gently. He didn't stir. He trusted me that deeply. And still they didn't see. They'd asked me to make place cards. They didn't ask me to sit. They'd asked for money, not wisdom, for my kitchen, not my company. And as I stared at the flickering lights of the tree, our tree, I felt something inside me freeze. Not like fear, more like steel cooling after fire. This wedding wasn't happening in my house anymore. Not in my heart, not in my hands. I would not bake another cake. I would not lace another favor bag. I would not write another check. I would not smile for another photo where I was asked to step out of frame. They had mistaken my silence for consent. They had mistaken my giving for bottomlessness. They had mistaken my love for servitude. So the cake stayed in the freezer. And that night after they'd gone off to bed, or gone off to their next party, I stood barefoot in the kitchen, wrapped in my old robe, and stared at the moon through the frosted window pane. Then I picked up the phone. I called the florist, canceled the order, then the caterer, the DJ, the table linen rentals. One by one, I unraveled what I had built. They wouldn't know until morning. I didn't do it out of revenge. I did it because something had finally clicked into place, something I'd spent too long ignoring. This was my house, my money, my time, my labor. And if they couldn't make room at the table for the man who raised them, or the woman who held them, through every storm, then they wouldn't be using my table at all. Some people burn bridges in rage. I just closed the doors they left swinging open, quietly, with grace, and a note on the fridge for the morning that read, "The cake is still in the freezer. You'll have to find another venue." I thought they'd come storming down the stairs, red-faced, voices raised. I thought there'd be a knock at my bedroom door, some desperate confrontation, a tearful demand for explanation. But morning came quietly. No thunder, no shouts, just soft footsteps in the hallway, hushed voices behind closed doors, and the unmistakable weight of disbelief settling into the walls. I heard them discover the note. I heard the silence that followed. And I waited, not in fear, not even in anger, but in something else entirely. A calm so deep it felt almost like grief, but not quite. It was something cleaner, like the breath you take when a heavy storm finally passes and the world is still damp, but the sky is clear. I made tea for the two of us as always, chamomile for him, strong black for me with a splash of milk and nothing else. We sat in the sunroom the same way we had for years, watching the light stretch across the floorboards, like a slow-moving prayer. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't have to. "I didn't serve the cake," I said. He looked at me, eyes crinkling softly. "That's all right." "I canceled the wedding," I added. Still, he didn't flinch, just nodded like he already knew. "I didn't do it to hurt them," I said. "I know," he replied. We sat like that for a long time, and in the silence I realized something simple and devastating they might never understand. They might never ask, never apologize, never see what they had done to us, what they had allowed to happen under our roof, under our names. But I would no longer try to convince them. Because the moment you stop chasing people to prove your worth, something incredible happens. You find yourself again right where you left her. That afternoon they came downstairs, one by one, cautious, quiet. I saw them peeking toward the kitchen, then toward the living room, like they weren't sure what they were stepping into, as if the house had rearranged itself overnight. Someone asked, "Can we talk?" I said, "Of course." We sat at the table. No ceremony this time, no toasts, just the dull clink of coffee mugs and the soft rustle of napkins being unfolded for no real reason. I saw the note they said. "I know. Is this because of the planning? Because we didn't include you enough?" I looked at them, really looked, and for the first time I saw how young they still were in all the ways that mattered, how blind, how insulated by the world they had built around their own reflections. "It's because I remembered who I am," I said. A pause. "I've been generous," I continued, "and I don't regret that. But generosity without respect isn't love. It's exploitation. And I won't participate in that anymore. But we didn't mean to." "I know," I said. "That's what makes it worse. You didn't even notice." They stared down at the table, hands folding and unfolding napkins, cheeks flushed with something between shame and confusion. "I have always been here," I said, "cooking, cleaning, planning, giving. But somewhere along the way you stopped seeing me. You stopped seeing him, and you replaced gratitude with expectation. I didn't realize. That's the point. The silence that followed was thick with reckoning. "I'm not angry," I said at last. "Not anymore. But I'm not going to keep sacrificing myself for a version of family that no longer sees me as human." "I didn't think it meant that much," one of them whispered. "The chair, the cranberry sauce, the cake." "It wasn't the chair," I said softly. "It was what the missing chair represented." He entered the room just then, slowly, gently, as he always did. They looked at him, really looked. And for a fleeting second I saw it. That flicker of recognition. The old man in the cardigan who once lifted them into the sky. The man with the trembling hands who used to hold their whole world together with calloused palms. He didn't say a word, just nodded at them and took his seat beside me. They didn't apologize, but they didn't argue either. And sometimes that's enough to mark a beginning. Later I walked into the kitchen, opened the freezer, and looked at the cake. Still there, still wrapped, still untouched. I thought about tossing it, about letting it thaw into a puddle, and then scraping it into the sink. But instead I left it right where it was. Not as a symbol, not as a punishment, but as a reminder that I don't have to give away every piece of myself just to make a room feel full. Christmas morning came with a hush, the kind of quiet that isn't sad but sacred. The snow outside was light and steady, blanketing the yard in a softness that made even the ugliest corners of the world seem gentle. The house was still except for the kettle on the stove and the occasional creak of wood settling beneath old footsteps. He and I sat by the window with our tea. No guests, no cameras, no glittering to-do lists or demands for approval. Just the two of us. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to host anything. I didn't feel the need to perform. We were simply being, together, breathing in the silence like it was warm air. He wore the same wool cardigan, threadbare at the elbows. I had mended it once before and would probably do it again. He cupped his mug with both hands, letting the steam rise into his face, softening the lines that had deepened over the years. I watched him for a long time, and I thought about all the Christmases we'd lived through. The ones where we barely had enough money for gifts, so we wrapped up baked goods and homemade cards and told the kids that magic mattered more than wrapping paper. The ones where the power went out and we lit every candle in the house and played charades by firelight. The ones with too much noise, too much mess, too much everything. And yet we loved every minute of it because we were together. But this one with all its quiet, all its space, it might have been the most honest of them all. Because it wasn't built on expectation. It was built on choice. The choice to stop giving everything away. The choice to stop making room for people who wouldn't scoot their chairs over for us. The choice to look at the man beside me and say, "This is still a life. This is still enough." I had given them silence, not to punish, but to breathe. And in that silence I heard myself again. He looked over at me then and said, "You seem lighter." And I was. Not because anything had been fixed, but because I had stopped waiting for them to fix it. That was never the lesson. The lesson was that peace doesn't come from being seen. It comes from seeing yourself clearly and refusing to shrink back into someone else's shadow. I reached over, laced my fingers with his, and we sat like that until the tea cooled and the morning sun stretched higher in the sky. Upstairs, I could hear the slow shuffle of feet. Maybe they'd come down with apologies. Maybe they wouldn't. I didn't need them anymore. Not like that. I had found something they couldn't give me, and couldn't take from me either. Dignity. Stillness. A love that didn't need to prove itself in front of an audience. That night, after the sun had long set and the wind whistled soft lullabies through the shutters, I opened the freezer one last time. The cake was still there. I pulled it out, unwrapped it slowly, cut 2 slices. He took one, I took the other. We ate in silence, forks tapping gently against the china. And when he finished, he leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, smile wide, and said, "This tastes like something we earned." I nodded. Because we had.